So I'll just try to project loud enough for everybody to hear me, and until Adrian gets here with the microphone. So this is our third of the 5 lectures. So we're right at the midway point of our little journey into archetypal psychology and James Hillman, and I want us to consider everything I'm saying as about archetypal psychology as simultaneously a kind of organic evolution out of the depth psychology tradition that comes through Jung. Okay, and at the same time, it's a kind of rebellion against that. It's an outgrowth of it, but it's an outgrowth that also has this this defiance, this reformation, this rebellion, and out of that comes something new that you can't reduce to Jungian psychology, and yet you can't understand it without it. In that sense, it's very much like emergence theory. The whole idea of emergence is something that, in scientific terms, that in which you can't understand a given phenomenon in the course of evolution solely on the basis of the preceding factors that contribute to it. You can't reduce it to a lower level. It's not a reductionist view. Something creative takes place that kind of self-organizes out of the starting factors and brings it to something new, and something that's essentially creative. And archetypal psychology is very much a creative intervention in the history of depth psychology, and I'm trying to unpack the ways in which it is creative as well as continuous with the longer depth psychology tradition. In a sense, therefore, the lectures are a kind of dialogue between Hillman and Jung. And in addition, they are a dialogue, a kind of trialogue, to use the etymologically totally incorrect way of saying it, but comes out of Rupert Sheldrake and Ralph Abraham and those guys talking about trialogues, and that kind of caught on. So in a way, it's also a trialogue between Hillman and Jung and myself, just necessarily because it's coming out of my framing of it, my articulation. So you're kind of hearing a discussion amongst the 3 sensibilities. So let's, in terms of the division of today's class, again, I'll do the first half. I'll continue to lecture about Hillman's. I'll basically be providing a context through which we can be understanding revisioning psychology, which is the current text you're looking at, and then the second half of the talk, or of the class, really, will be a participatory dialogue with you, bringing in the various passages that have stimulated you, and we'll discuss those together. But for this first half, I'm continuing that, drawing upon numerous lectures and seminars that Hillman gave over the years that provide a kind of a frame of reference that you can't really get from any place else, like from his writings in particular, and yet kind of shine a light that I think is especially helpful, particularly because these are very autobiographical reflections. And as Hillman says, every psychology is a confession. He's, again, playing on Nietzsche's recognition that every philosophy is a confession, which was a huge breakthrough when Nietzsche said that, because right away, I mean, that's a crucial postmodern moment when Nietzsche sees that even the most objectifying claim about truth, and perhaps especially the most objectifying claim about truth, is a revelation of subjective factors that have shaped the individual's vision, even a metaphysical vision, even a scientific vision. Last night, some of us went to hear Robert Bellah, who great scholar who wrote The Religion and Human Evolution, the kind of magnum opus that many of us have read in the last few months. And he's a great sociologist of religion. I think I referred to him once before in these lectures. And he read that passage that's well known from Steven Weinberg about the more, he's the cosmologist, the more we understand about the cosmos, the more comprehensible it seems to be, the more pointless it seems to be. And as much as we want to try to understand the universe as something that that kind of led to us in a comforting, cozy way, bottom line, the universe is a kind of unremittingly hostile, indifferent cosmos, et cetera, et cetera. And you can find similar passages in Jacques Monod, in Richard Dawkins. And what Bellah points out, as I have as well over the years, is just these statements reveal something about the scientists saying them. They're not pure science. The vision of the universe as unremittingly hostile and different says something about one's whole relationship to the other and to the matrix out of which one has come, and perhaps about one's relationship to one's mother. We won't speculate further there right now, but these are psychological statements. They're not purely objective scientific statements. And in that sense, Nietzsche makes a great postmodern move, which Hillman is elaborating with great creativity and nuance throughout his life. All right, so let's go now to this kind of comparison that Hillman wants to make between archetypal psychology and orthodox Jungian psychology, which in some sense is even more, not pure Jung. It's almost more orthodox than Jung. As you know, Jung said, "I'm glad I'm not a Jungian," because he would have been confined to be that. And at the same time, he also said, really, nobody can be a Jungian except for me. That being said, just as happened with psychoanalysis, where people like Ernest Jones became more Freudian than Freud, and really got on Freud's case for pushing the margins in his later works that made somebody like an Ernest Jones or Carl Abraham uncomfortable with the threat to orthodoxy. So too with Jung. There was some of that, though Jung was, I think, had made everybody aware of just of how adventurous he was. But in the next generation, where you get particularly Marie-Louise von Franz and Edinger, but others as well, you get a kind of systematizing of what is regarded as essential Jungian psychology, and that's the contrast and comparison that Hillman wants to draw out. So one of the things he points out is that the stress in archetypal psychology is on eccentricity rather than wholeness, which is parallel to the one we've discussed many times, where the stress is on multiplicity rather than unity. multiplicity and differentiation. It's on soul-making rather than individuation, which means to Hillman it's less a progressive process through opposition, which is kind of the Hegelian background of Jung. It's less that than it is a pathless being present in the world. It's an attitude, not a method. And above all, it's got a respect for the psyche, which is clearly something he shares with Jung. Now, another shared view with the Jungian orthodoxy is that there's a recognition that neurosis is essentially one-sidedness. Hence the need to explore the unconscious. This really comes out of Freud. Freud recognizes, as does Jung, as does Hillman, as does Groff, and the whole depth psychology tradition, the symptom is a sign of what's not being included. We see that in a social situation, a political context. I mean, when like the Occupy movement, like, is all about what's not being included, and just as it happens in a society, so it happens in a psyche. That the symptom is the sign of what's not being included, and so it's pressing in from the unconscious on consciousness, and consciousness has to deal with it. If it doesn't, it suffers neurosis. Or it acts out in ways that can be very problematic. Neurosis, therefore, this is Jung's description that Hillman adds to, is inauthentic suffering because it creates a compromise formation, a substitute for what's actually going on. And thirdly, it is, the neurosis represents some form of a disorder of meaning. Now that's very strong with Jung and Hillman, more than Freud. Freud has almost a hydraulic sense of psychopathology, where the id is pressing in on the ego, but the ego, under pressure from civilization and the superego, suppresses the id and creates symptomatic formations that are very uncomfortable. But it's almost, as I say, the id has a kind of almost hydraulic, it's pressure, and the ego is like this mechanism that's holding it back, or mechanisms of defense, etc. And by comparison, Jung is much more coming out of an explicitly humanistic, romantic, capital R, hermeneutic, which is looking at meaning as being essential to psychological healing and wholeness. By the way, that whole focus on the symptom and the neurosis are the sign of what's not being included, and therefore the necessity to explore the unconscious. This is why transpersonal psychology, as kind of articulated and embodied in Groff's work with the not only psychedelic therapy, but in the entire notion that he evolved later of the holotropic. Holotropic is Greek for moving, well, it's a Greek neologism as he put it together. That means moving towards wholeness, wholeness, tropic, trepain, to move towards wholeness. And just like a heliotropic plant turns towards the sun, so the holotropic psyche is trying to always move towards wholeness. And from Groff's point of view, the way you most powerfully and effectively move towards wholeness is through exploring non-ordinary states of consciousness that permit the emergence of the suppressed material. Paying attention to one's dreams is, of course, a that's another non-ordinary state of consciousness that is rich, replete with images that are coming from what's not being included. Now, in terms of further debts and influences that Hillman acknowledges, beginning with Freud, he sees there's the tremendous importance of recognizing the role of repression. Just in what I was discussing a second ago, you can see that. And Hillman sees this as Freud's fundamental idea of repression. And I think it's Ernest Jones that actually uses that. It says this is the fundamental idea of Freud and psychoanalysis. But Hillman seconds that and says, in the whole notion of the unconscious, which is so globally significant to the history of depth psychology, derives from first the notion of repression. Thanks so much. Testing 1, 2, 3. Let's see. Can you hear me in the back, David, Richard? Does it sound great? What is repressed is our history, and that what is repressed always comes back. I apply this notion to history, at the civilizational level. For a great civilization, history is the unconscious, and that's why we so require addressing history in our at this moment in our history, because the power of our civilization, for good or ill, has such destructive potential at this point that the repressed unconscious of our history is threatening to swallow us up. From Nietzsche, Hillman recognizes the importance of what he calls the upside downing of all values. The term that Nietzsche used was the transvaluation of all values. But that upside downing of values, the way Hillman loves to look at something from below, like everybody else is looking at it, this view, and then Hillman gets underneath in the underworld, from the symptomatic point of view, and sees the less familiar level and turns it around. There's that quote that he takes from Nietzsche in the endnotes. By the way, I hope that you're how should I put this? You're taking the pleasure of doing yourself the favor of reading Hillman's footnotes in Revisioning Psychology, because the footnotes, they're endnotes. The endnotes have so many great. They're more than just a kind of scholarly apparatus, though I think they represent great scholarship. They're kind of like Shakespearean asides, and he's getting a lot of his crucial points out there, and there's the whole way he has of using endnotes as a kind of commentary on the main text. The main text is kind of like what he's saying at the lectern in front of the several hundred people, but in the endnotes, he's kind of saying little things, making references to the particular scholars or influences that he has been enriched by, giving the quotations and so forth. And it's a great parallel track to read this book with and to enrich your grasp of the book. Going to the endnotes is reading the notes is just a continuously significant thing with Hillman. I know it very much influenced me when I wrote Passion of the Western Mind. Hillman's model was very much in the back of my mind, And I remember when I did an interview with Michael Krasny on Forum more than 20 years ago now, when the Passion of the Western Mind came out, and we spent much of the hour on the endnotes. I mean, that's what he was particularly reading too, and I think that's I definitely owed that to Hillman's model. But in the endnotes, he has a wonderful quotation from, in terms of the upside downing of all values, where he quotes Nietzsche. This at least is certain, that we should not, this is Nietzsche from Twilight of the Idols, near the end of his writing life. This at least, he's talking about the Renaissance. This at least is certain, that we should not dare to stand amid the conditions which prevailed at the Renaissance. We should not even dare to imagine ourselves in those conditions. Do not let us doubt that we moderns, wrapped in the thick cotton wool of our humanitarianism, which would shrink from grazing a stone, would present a comedy to Cesar Borgia's contemporaries, which would literally make them die of laughter. And this is the typical overstatement of by Nietzsche that is necessarily is so evocative of a truth. Here's another one from when he's talking about this is that whole, you know how Hillman, even though he is against dualism, he loves constellating polarities. We've talked about, spirit versus soul, Hebraic versus Hellenic, North versus South, and another one is definitely the Reformation versus the Renaissance, with Hillman clearly on the side of the Renaissance. And one of the root metaphors, he says, of the field of Renaissance studies is just this polarity, and the Renaissance becomes an instrument for attacking the North, Germany, the Reformation, pietism, modernity, rationality, practicality, superego, and so on. Then, this is again in the endnotes, Nietzsche provides the overstated maxim for this idea of the Renaissance. Quote, does anybody at last understand, will anybody understand what the Renaissance was? The transvaluation of Christian values, the attempt undertaken with all means, all instincts, and all genius to make the opposite values, the noble values, triumph. There has never yet been a more decisive question than the Renaissance. That's Nietzsche with his bracing attack on Christianity, and Christianity, humanitarianism, this way of the fact that Hillman would have, as you're going to read these next 2 weeks, a whole quarter of the book against humanism. I mean, humanism is like a kind of sacred to us in certain respects, and yet here, this is Hillman's take, and that's coming in part from Nietzsche, that upside downing of values that he appreciates. Another influence he mentions particularly is Karenyi. Karl Karenyi, the great mythologist, Hungarian. He wrote on Dionysus, on Hermes, Prometheus, like a big book each, or long essay monographs, and particularly from Karenyi, perhaps even more than from Jung, because Karenyi was such a mythologist, but at the same time was seeing them psychologically and culturally. From Karenyi, Hillman got the understanding that the gods are styles of existence. They're ways of being in the world. The same world can be constructed in different ways, constructed in different ways, so it is seen differently and therefore lived differently. and this leads right into that description of the archetypes right at the very beginning, where he talks about archetypes like gods rule different cosmoses that hold in their sway everything we do, see, and say. Another interesting influence that I would not have perceived if Hillman hadn't said it is Spinoza. As Hillman put it, Spinoza was the only Jew to be thrown out of Judaism. Another thing that makes him attractive to Hillman. And his monism, this is Spinoza's, went as far as you could take it. This is Hillman's description, so that God became nature, totally. There's no transcendent being outside of nature for Spinoza, so there's nowhere else to go. So this is it, buddy. That's Hillman's vernacular way of expressing that Spinozistic monism. And then for you real intellectual historians in the room, another crucial person for Hillman, which you would have seen in revisioning psychology, is Dill Thigh. That's spelled D-I-L-T-H-E-Y, Dill Thigh. Because from him really comes that essential differentiation between a psychology of understanding versus a psychology of explanation. You get the difference that explanations, as Hillman puts it, deceive us into thinking we understand. But from Hillman's point of view, depth psychology originally comes out of this mold of really, it comes from Dill Thigh, and out of which comes Jaspers as well. As Hillman says, evolutionary genetics, does it really help us understand? He just leaves it right hanging like that, but he hates scientistic reductionism. And for him, it represents a kind of style of understanding that is satisfying to a certain kind of mind, that is not Hillman's kind of mind, and is not a kind of mind that he particularly holds in high regard. Another of the great philosophers that Hillman is deeply appreciative of is William James. And you can guess why. I mean, Hillman loves the way James attacks philosophers of wholeness, that are monolithic in their metaphysics, because he sees them as carrying too much the intimation that we live in a closed universe rather than an open universe, which was James's primary commitment, that we live in an open universe. There's something ultimately unpredictable about it, and that in that openness of the universe rests human freedom. And if you can access your own sense of freedom in the depths of your own consciousness, because we are emergent from the universe itself has that same quality all the way down. Indeterminacy is another way of putting that. Hegel's in the background of James's attack. I mean, he with Hegel's constant movement towards an overall unity that integrates all polarities, all opposites, and but of course materialism is another kind of closed universe that James was attacking too. And so James said what really matters is the eachness of things, returning to the particular. Hillman maintains a kind of interesting dialectic all the time between, on the one hand, attending to the archetypal, which is a form of the universal, and attending to the very particular, the very concrete, through the image. Like what's that act? He said, I don't want to just go directly to, if you have a dream about a tiger, I don't want to just go directly to capital T tiger and then look up in a book of, myths and archetypes. What does archetypal T, tiger, mean? I want to know how is the tiger moving? What was its color? What was the mood of the tiger? Was it could you make out the quality of the coat on of the tiger, etc. It's he's wanting to particularize it. After the Victorian Romantics, James and modernists as well in the artistic tradition criticized this movement towards the whole with a focus on eachness in clarity, how each phenomenon is different than another. And Hillman is picking up on that strand that comes out of the beginning of the 20th century. Another personal influence from someone who was in the Eranos circle was Adolf Portland, who was a marine biologist from the University of Basel, a macrobiologist and a marine biologist, studied animal behavior, and particularly the idea that an animal's display is a presentation of self, and we read the world aesthetically as animals do. We see, we smell. He points out how, like, an animal reads our psyche at once. I mean, the frightened person, the dog picks up on right away if there's any fear, no matter how much the person may have seemingly controlled the fear for other people to see. The dog picks it up. The dog picks up the anxiety, carrying the drug through the airport or whatever, and that aesthetic presentational. This is very Whiteheadian in a sense, picking up the. This is aesthesis in not just in the sense of beauty, but aesthetic, but aesthesis in the sense of apprehending with our senses, the way, but with our sort of fully engaged senses, the way an animal is in the world. This will be this theme, for those of you who are interested, will be picked up in our last week's reading in the Soul of the World, Anima Mundi, the Return of the Soul to the World, and it's also explored in The Thought of the Heart, which is the essay that's in that same book. And there's another book that he wrote called Dream Animals that he discussed it. And then he pays allegiance to Vico. Vico was a 17th century Italian who was a kind of father of sociology. He was very much into recognizing sort of mythological structures that informed history. You see this right up to when you get later to people like Spengler or Gebser. They're in that tradition. And Vico hated Descartes. He's coming, very soon after Descartes. And from Hillman's point of view, his hating Descartes is one of Vico's great virtues. Like Goethe's hating of Linnaeus for being so categorizing. Hillman embraces hatred. He says hatred is very useful for driving one's work into new territory. I remember once the person that first introduced us, that I told you about before, Gordon Tappan, who was an old friend of Hillman's, older than Hillman. He, in the early 80s, I don't know, or maybe the mid 80s, he told me that Hillman had just recently seen Hillman, and that Hillman hadn't written anything recently. And he said to Gordon, his friend, he said, "I haven't written anything recently because I haven't been angry enough. I need anger to press me into into the creative act. It's interesting. I can see how that can work, perhaps particularly with a certain kind of sensibility, very strong Mars, double Aries as he is, etc. But one can write and feel inspired to write for a number of reasons. But think about the way in which, if you get an email that really pisses you off, how you can really dash off a response very quickly. It's a good idea to maybe hold off on clicking send for an hour or two or overnight. But the inspiration to compose is quite available to one in that moment, and that's Hillman obviously was able to flourish in that way. So he said, so he talks about how hatred is useful for driving one's work into new territory, and then he, at this point in his talk, he says something that's a beautiful, concise statement about metaphor. He says, a metaphor is a myth in brief. Myths, and then he says, myths are universals of imagination. He often doesn't use the article the when he talks about, like, he doesn't say the imagination, he just says imagination, or he doesn't say the soul, the way like the Christian soul that's kind of inside each of us. He says soul. That's coming in a way out of the Neoplatonic, the Greek way of speaking, and the Neoplatonic description of soul or psyche as a dimension of being rather than an entity. It's a mode of being. It's more than even a dimension. It's a mode of being. I think it's similar to the Whiteheadian move to turn nouns into verbs. You know, like that. I'm not Rick Tarnas. I'm Rick Tarnasing. It's like it's a mode of being. It's more of a process. It's a verb in action rather than this Cartesian skin-encapsulated ego kind of. And because myths are universals of imagination, that's why they're so healing. And here's Hillman talking positively about healing. He said, we suffer from disorders of the imagination because we've lost touch with the ground. Now, at this point in this particular lecture, which was in 2000, in late August of 2000, an audience member said, respectfully, it was a woman, said, you've been listing your influences. Are there any women? And because you've been hearing one after another, you know, of course, Jung and Freud and Nietzsche and Karenyi and Adolf Portland and Spinoza, etc. And he said, yes, there was Suzanne Langer, for example. Suzanne Langer was someone influenced by Whitehead. She wrote a wonderful book called Philosophy in a New Key, a brilliant book. But then but he just said that one person, and then the audience member asked, were there any women at Eranos? Because a lot of the people he was mentioning were at Eranos. And Hillman pointed out, he said, the woman who founded it, who was Olga Frobe Kaptein, the woman who founded Eranos didn't want any women there, or any wives of the scholars that she invited. The Von Franz was there, however, once or twice that Hillman remembered. Also, Agnella Jaffe, the one who kind of co-wrote the Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and was a truly wonderful sensibility. If you ever get a chance to see one of the films on Jung that have her interviewed, you see what a kind of precious person she was in the best sense. Her eyes carried deep soul and a fast intelligence, and she was very generously had a deep heart, and at the same time could be incisive. Anyway, she would come sometimes. Kathleen Raine, the Blake Yeats scholar, British literary scholar, came a couple of times, but by and large, women were not there. I've seen a film where both Tony Wolfe and Emma Jung were there together, and but they weren't presenting. They didn't present there, but they were there, and they were kind of off to the side smoking together, which is kind of interesting. I mean, you know, they were the two major love relationships of Jung's life, and this was early 50s. I think it was 1951. They seemed at ease with each other. The crucial thing to recognize, though, I want to point out three ways that Hillman's not either remembering at that moment or perhaps acknowledging the role of women in both archetypal psychology, but more broadly and deeply, depth psychology. I think we first have to recognize that even though Freud and Jung stand out as the crucial protagonists in the emergence of and the formulation of depth psychology, you could bring in William James too, from another vantage point, from the American perspective. But it was women who came to Freud in Vienna and to Jung in Zurich, who really kind of, I don't even want to say kind of, they collaborated and co-created depth psychology in the intimate environment of the consulting room, the clinic, where the women in some sense were bringing in the vulnerability of the late 19th century psyche in the Central European cities, Vienna, Zurich, and they were like the canaries in the gold mine of the European psyche, and not having perhaps the same armored, egoic structures to suppress the emergence of the unconscious. They were the ones who, in many ways, mediated the emergence of the unconscious in such a way that with the collaboration of these men who had the degrees, who had the patriarchal authority, who were in the physician's role, the healer's role, who were themselves, however, suffering psychologically. That is, the men were, the physicians. And people like Anna O, for example, who went to Freud's mentor, Breuer, and that's not her real name, that's her name from the case histories. And her real name was Bertha von Pappenheim, and she later became a major player in a really significant social activist, feminist, Jewish woman in the Viennese world at the turn of the century, and did very courageous work as a woman there. But when she was doing the deep inner work, as she was dealing with her own psychological disturbance, I mean, she was going deep inside and bringing up material, and she was discovering through almost kind of like the capacity to sort of self-trance or self-hypnotize, an ability to kind of mediate the emergence of unconscious material that she felt as being healing or transformative in the process of bringing it up. And it's moves like that, it's interventions like that that take place often initiated by the patient, not by, I mean, the physician is paying attention, encouraging, providing a frame, a stable frame of reference for a framework for it to happen. But it's definitely a co-created activity. And in the course of the next 20, 30 years, where people like Sabina Spielrein and Tony Wolff are coming to Jung, they're really bringing crucial ideas to him as he's giving them crucial ideas. And of course, it's Tony Wolff who also provides a tremendous psychological orientation and grounding all through the years of Jung's descent. And you can see this with Lou Salome's influence on I think you can see it most explicitly, her influence on Freud, but it's also in the background of her influence on Jung, her influence on Nietzsche, who fell in love with Lou Salome. I did a whole course here a few years ago on Nietzsche, Freud, and Jung. The solar hero descends into the underworld, where we focused not just on those three, but on these women and looking at their charts as well as Nietzsche, Freud, and Jung's, and the crucial things that they were bringing into the equation. So I want to. A lot of times we don't have the names of the patients, and the women often were playing less publicly certifiable roles, and yet were no less crucial. And during the years of Jungian psychology's most for much of the 20th century, the three people who were the crucial they were the crucial figures, the pillars in Zurich of analytical psychology were Jung, Emma Jung, and Tony Wolff. Those three, you went to one of those three as your primary analyst for years, and so they kind of play an enormously important role. Later, you have, of course, von Franz. You have there's a whole book on the major women disciples of Jung who played it's called the Valkyries, or also Jung's women. I can't remember the author's name right now, but it's a helpful book with chapters on each of these women. And of course, in psychoanalysis, you've got Melanie Klein, you've got Anna Freud, you've got Karen Horney, you've got Helena Deutsch, all of whom brought the work to new levels. And then finally, with archetypal psychology itself, the crucial figures who were together at the birth were Hillman and Rafael Pedraza Lopez and Patricia Berry, who was Hillman's partner and then wife for many years. And so she also played a critical role. And in later years, you have people like Mary Watkins and Nora Hall and Jeanette Paris. Now, one of the things that Hillman likes to do is to question how we're using words, and he'll bring a word that hasn't been used for a long time, and often is like a taboo word or a negated word like soul, and he'll bring it into new appreciation and new centrality. But then he'll also take words and question whether they're any longer useful to us. And he gave a few examples of words or concepts from the past that he feels or felt at that point needed to be plowed under, as he put it. transference, the unconscious, the ego, projection. He said, are these words overused? Are we too comfortable with them? Do we think we know what they refer to? Because that's a sign that they're no longer serving as conveyors of the mystery, because the unconscious is essentially what we don't know, and to think we can contain it with that kind of a noun appellation is very misleading. He said they're not working for us anymore. They don't stimulate us. They don't provoke. The angel has left them. Remember how he's talking about the angelology of words? The angel has left them. Boy, there's a poetic way of describing in a moment, in a single short sentence, a whole. He's talking about the way in which every word is a symbol, and a symbol is not just a straightforward sign of this means that in a concrete entity way, but it's rather a participatory entrance into a mysterious dimension. And if the word no longer carries that numinosity of the mysterious, which has a certain ambiguity in that needs to be explored and unpacked and almost passively or received as well as rather than controlled. To that extent, a word may no longer be useful from Hillman's point of view. So what Hillman's been doing in the material I've been sharing with you right now is, he said, I want to be showing the difference in emphases and commonalities between Jung and Jungian psychology in its orthodox form and archetypal psychology, to counter those who would say that archetypal psychology is only Jung dressed up in Hillman's words. But also I want to counter those who think that it's a radically separate, even opposed stream, which is the way the orthodox, in quite a few places in the Jungian psychology world, Hillman was persona non grata and wouldn't be talked about, even though he's so spectacularly creative, a phenomenon within the coming out of the Jungian world. He made certain guardians of the church uncomfortable. So one of the differences that he points out between his own perspective and the conventional Jungian perspective is, he says, I don't talk about types at all. Like the introverted intuitive, the extroverted sensate, that kind of thing. He says, I think it's not that important. It's a great simplification. Jung himself said, it's not for typing people, but it's rather for relativizing styles of knowledge. It's for typing ideas more than people. He thought it was a misuse to just type a person that way. Hillman also opposes something that he sees in the Orthodox Jungian world. When Edinger says Jung is 100 years ahead of his time, Hillman says, I object to this. Why make him into a saint and prophet? You lose the psychological standpoint when you do that. Spirit, compared with psyche, spirit is always superior. It's always wise. It's inflated. It's dominant. It's hierarchical. You lose the psychological standpoint if you make that kind of superior statement about this person's 100 years in front of ahead of his time, and he's a prophet, etc. I mean, I personally think Jung had an authentically prophetic quality, but a book like Answer to Job is completely a prophetic phenomenon. I mean, he wrote it in a state of white heat. He described it, and he said, it's the only thing I wrote that I would not change a word of now. He wrote it in pain, like Prometheus is undergoing, he's in bed in a very painful liver condition. And anyway, I think it's an authentically prophetic work, but at the same time, to get into to do what I think, what Edinger tends to do, which is to say, Jung was this great prophet, and this is Edinger talking literally in one of his late interviews, Jungian psychology today, though, is going to the dogs. It's that kind of superior spiritual statement of what's important and what's not in a kind of hierarchical way. That Hillman says, when you do that, you lose the moment of aesthetics, the beauty of the moment. You lose life, the vitality, by spiritualizing the psyche. For him, Edinger and von Franz represented a theology of the self. The archetype of the spirit turns Jung into a spiritual prophet, a guru. And that's what triggers books like The Jung Cult by Richard Knoll, which is such an attack and distortion of who Jung is, but it's a compensation for the overly exalted image of Jung as this sublime, unprecedented prophet of the era. Jung himself, Hillman praises him for making the huge move with having the idea of the God image. That totally relativizes fundamentalism in Christianity. So you're no longer talking about God, you're talking about the God image. The God image is the way psyche is interpreting, experiencing God at that time. It's not the God separate in some objective form that one can independently assess and say this is the way things actually are.
Great.
Yes.
The microphone went out for some reason.
Okay.
Does it look like battery died?
Our 15-minute break, and we can just change the batteries right now. Okay, so we'll take a break, come back for just a finish of this, and then we'll do the second half of the lecture.